When you hear the name Ted Bundy, you probably think of, well, pure evil. But what if we could go deeper than the headlines? What if we could perform a kind of psychological autopsy? Using a detailed academic study, that's exactly what we're going to do. Trace the development of the man behind the monster. So look at this. On one side, you've got the face Ted Bundy showed the world. Handsome, smart, and just disarmingly charming. And on the other side, the absolutely chilling contents of his car. I mean, we're talking handcuffs, a crowbar, a ski mask, and that right there, that's the central paradox of Ted Bundy. It's the mystery we're exploring today. So, yeah, how does that happen? How does a person go from being this bright, charming guy to, well, a monster? That's the question we're diving into in this explainer, using a deep psychobiographical study to map out that very journey. Okay, so to even begin to untangle this puzzle, we first need to get a handle on the tools the researcher used, because this isn't just a simple biography, it's a very structured psychological investigation. The specific method they used is called psychobiography. So what is that? Well, think of it like this. It's about taking established psychological theories and using them like a map to trace a person's entire life. You're looking for patterns, for turning points, and especially for developmental failures that might just explain who that person became. And the specific map for this autopsy is a really famous one. Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. It gives us a lens, you know? It lets us look at Bundy's life not as just one long story, but as a series of really crucial developmental stages. So, Erikson's whole idea was that all of us, as we grow up, go through these different stages. And in each stage, we face a fundamental crisis. Now, if you resolve it, great. You build a healthy personality. But if you don't, that damage, it gets carried forward, affecting every single stage that comes after. We're going to focus on these first 6, since Bundy was executed when he was 42. All right, so let's put this framework into action. We're going to start right at the very beginning, because the study we're looking at argues that the cracks in Bundy's psychological foundation, they formed in his very first moments of life. Okay, so listen to this. This is Ted Bundy, just one day before his execution, describing his own childhood. Sounds perfect, right? Like something out of a 1950s sitcom. But the reality that this study uncovered, it was something else entirely. The study paints a completely different picture. We're talking about a childhood born into secrecy and really deception. He was separated from his mom for those crucial first few months and was raised in a family that was built on this huge lie about who he even was. And this brings us right back to Erikson's very first stage, trust versus mistrust. This is the absolute bedrock of our personality. It's where a baby learns, through consistent, reliable care, that, hey, the world is a safe place. I can trust it. And right here, this is the study's first huge finding. The researcher argues that because of all that early chaos, the separation, the family lies, Bundy never, ever resolved this first crisis. He didn't build that basic trust. Instead, what became his foundation was a deep, fundamental mistrust of the world. So as we move on into Bundy's teenage years, you're gonna see how that tiny crack in the foundation just gets wider and wider, especially during those critical years when you're supposed to be building a stable sense of who you are. So now we jump to Erikson's fourth stage, industry versus inferiority. This is that time in life when kids start looking around and measuring themselves against everyone else. You know, am I good at sports? Am I smart? Do I fit in? If you feel like you do, you build competence. If not, you're left with this deep, nagging feeling of inferiority. And check this out. In Bundy's own words, we see exactly how that played out for him. He was just haunted by feeling like he wasn't good enough, always jealous of the other kids who seemed to have all the goodies that he lacked. He was completely failing to build that sense of, hey, I can do this. And that feeling of not measuring up leads right into what is maybe the most critical stage for a teenager, identity versus role confusion. This is the big one, right? The who am I question. And Erikson had a warning here. If you can't figure that out, you might just adopt a negative identity. Basically, you become the exact opposite of what you're supposed to be. And for Bundy, the result of failing this stage was a personality that was completely fractured. On the outside, he created this persona, the public Bundy, you know, the charming, smart, ambitious guy. But the private Bundy, the one on the inside, that guy was just eaten up by inferiority, jealousy, and a total void where a real, stable identity should have been. So here's the key takeaway from that. The study suggests that the charming Ted Bundy we all saw, that wasn't him. It was a mask. His real identity became that negative one, a jumble of destructive roles he put on to hide the fact that deep down, at his core, there was basically nothing there. All right, so now we get to the final stage the study looks at. And this is where all those earlier failures, they all come together and the consequences are just catastrophic and violent. This is stage 6, intimacy versus isolation. So the idea is, once you've figured out who you are, the next big challenge is sharing that person with someone else in a real, meaningful relationship. And if you can't do that, the result is just this profound, crushing isolation. And this is a quote from his long-term girlfriend, and it is absolutely chilling. It shows you exactly what happened when he failed. You see, when he felt the pressure of a real relationship, something else just took over. He called it his sickness. Sometimes he called it the entity. And this study makes a direct, terrifying link between this and his crimes. Because he couldn't achieve real intimacy, he was trapped in this overwhelming isolation. So the entity that came out, it looked for connection through a horrifying substitute, violence. He couldn't connect with a person, so he would possess them as an object. The study even argues that his acts of necrophilia were this grotesque, twisted parody of the intimacy he was totally incapable of having with a living person. So, after all of this, after putting Bundy's entire life under this psychological microscope, what's the big takeaway? What does an analysis like this really tell us? Well, here's the study's central conclusion. Ted Bundy, the monster, wasn't born overnight in some sudden snap. No, he was built, piece by piece, over his entire life. Every single unresolved crisis, from the mistrust in his infancy to the confusion in his teens to the isolation as an adult, it was just another domino falling in a long, tragic line. And that leaves us with one last haunting question to think about. This study gives us a potential roadmap for how a person becomes a monster. But does understanding the developmental path that leads to evil make the final destination any less monstrous? That's something to chew on. You know, when you think of a serial killer, you probably picture a monster lurking in the shadows. But what if that monster was handsome, intelligent, charismatic, a guy everyone trusted? That's the story of Ted Bundy. He lived these two completely separate lives, and his case, well, it reveals this huge paradox, not just in his mind, but in how we even think about justice. So that's the real question here, isn't it? How does a monster just blend in? How did this guy, who is responsible for such unbelievable horror, just walk around in society completely unnoticed by so many people for so long? I mean, the difference between who people thought he was and who he really was is just staggering. The public saw a guy going to law school, a volunteer at a crisis hotline, a good guy. But the reality? A predator who admitted to more than 30 murders, a necrophile who did things that are just unspeakable. It's like a real-life Jekyll and Hyde, and honestly, it's absolutely terrifying. Okay, so to even begin to understand the monster, we have to take a look at the man. And that story starts way back in his early years, which might just hold the key to all the darkness that came later. Bundy's life started with this really profound lie. See, he was born in 1946, and he was raised to believe his grandparents were his parents, and that his own mother was his older sister. Imagine finding that out. That kind of foundational deception, it bred isolation. People who knew him then described him as super shy, quiet, a kid who got bullied a lot. From the very beginning, he was an outsider. And this quote from a psychobiographical study, it really cuts right to the heart of the whole thing. The theory is that Bundy might have never actually matured emotionally. So, what we were all seeing was this intelligent adult man, but his actions, they were being driven by the rage of a wounded, undeveloped child. And that child's rage, it wasn't going to stay hidden. After he escaped from prison for some other crimes, it just exploded. It led to one of the most infamous attacks in American history, a crime so brutal, so brazen, yet so forensically clean that he almost got away with it. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's the night of January 15th, 1978. Bundy forces his way into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State. And in the dark, he just unleashes this wave of violence, attacking 4 young women in their sleep, killing 2 of them. And this is where you really see his cunning. Bundy was careful. He didn't leave a single fingerprint. The survivors, who were attacked in the pitch black, They couldn't identify him. For the investigators, this was a complete nightmare. You have this horrific crime scene, but zero traditional evidence pointing to who did it. The case looked like it was hitting a dead end, but Bundy, in his arrogance, had made one tiny and very, very personal mistake. He left something that was just as unique as a fingerprint, but a whole lot more brutal. It was like a signature, written not in ink, but in violence. So this is where a pretty fascinating and, as we'll see, a really controversial field of science comes in: forensic odontology. Basically, it's the study of teeth for legal ID. The whole theory is that every single person's bite is unique. So a bite mark left on a victim can be traced back to one person and one person only. And on the body of one of the victims, Lisa Levy, investigators found exactly that. This bite mark, it became the single, solitary piece of physical evidence that connected an attacker to that scene. Literally everything was resting on this one mark. So, after a court order forced him to do it, investigators took a dental impression from Bundy. And what they found was, well, it was astonishing. His teeth were all uniquely misaligned, chipped, and crooked. Forensic odontologists took a model of his bite, laid it over the photos of the mark on Lisa Levy, and they declared it was a perfect match. They were sure they had their man. So, that bite mark evidence, it totally sealed Bundy's fate. It was the smoking gun that finally put the monster away for good. But while the case was closed back then, a huge question mark hangs over it now. Look, in his 1979 trial, that bite mark evidence was absolutely everything. It was the linchpin of the whole case for the prosecution, and it led directly to his conviction and eventually to his execution. At the time, it really seemed like justice had been served. But here's where the story takes a really modern twist. If Ted Bundy were on trial today for that same crime, would that same evidence even be allowed in court? Is it even considered reliable science anymore? And this, right here, this is the bombshell. A 1999 study found a false identification rate of 63% among certified forensic odontologists. Just let that sink in. 63%. The science that convicted one of the most notorious killers in history is now known to be incredibly unreliable. It turns out things like how skin stretches or what happens to a body after death can totally distort a bite mark, making a perfect match almost impossible. So this leaves us with a really, really unsettling question. There's no doubt Ted Bundy was a monster, but his conviction, the thing that put him away for good, it relied on a forensic technique that is now largely discredited. And it forces us to wonder, as science moves forward, how many other solved cases from history might not be as solid as we've always believed. So, how did they finally catch him? For years, Ted Bundy was one of America's most wanted, a serial killer who was so elusive because, well, he seemed to leave no clues behind. In this explainer, we're going to dig into the one single mistake that finally brought him to justice. You know, when psychologists studied Ted Bundy, they came up with this really chilling description. They said he had, quote, a diseased child's mind directing the actions of an adult male body. It's a paradox, right? And it's absolutely key to understanding who he was. And it's something we'll keep coming back to. Okay, so before we can get to how he was caught, you have to understand just how huge of a problem this was for law enforcement. For years, Bundy was basically a ghost. He was a cross-country predator who left a horrific trail of victims and just completely baffled the police. This timeline really shows you just how bold he was getting and what a nightmare it was for investigators trying to track him across state lines. It starts with a victim who miraculously escaped in '74. Then he's arrested, but then he escapes from prison. And if you can believe it, he escapes a second time and flees all the way to Florida. And that's where he commits his final horrific rampage at the Tri Omega sorority house in 1978. By then, he was one of the most wanted men in the country. I mean, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the investigators. They had almost nothing to go on. Bundy was so careful. He left no fingerprints, and this was before DNA analysis was even a thing. His attacks were so sudden and brutal that surviving victims often couldn't give a reliable ID. He was a phantom, and the case was getting colder by the day. But then, it all changed. In his final attack, after years of being this perfect ghost, he made one single careless mistake that would finally unmask the monster. So, at this horrific crime scene at the Chi Omega sorority house, police were looking for anything. And in all of that chaos, they found just one piece of physical evidence that could be traced back to the killer, a deep, very distinct bite mark on the body of Lisa Levy. And this right here, this was basically the prosecution's entire case. On the left, you've got a plaster cast made from Ted Bundy's actual teeth. On the right, that's a forensic photo of the bite mark. I mean, even just looking at it now, the connection is startling. This was the big aha moment. And this one piece of evidence, it basically threw this pretty obscure field of science called forensic odontology right into the national spotlight. It's really just the study of dental evidence in legal cases. Mostly it's used to identify human remains, but this case made it famous, and later, infamous, for bite mark comparison.
So, how'd they actually do it? How did they prove the link?
Well, it was a very careful 4-step process. First up, they photographed the bite mark with a little ruler next to it for scale. Next, they got a court order to make a dental impression of Bundy's teeth. Then came the big one, comparing the unique chips and twists in his dental cast to the photograph. And finally, the expert had to get on the stand and testify about how likely it was that this was a match.
And here's the real irony, right? For a guy who is supposedly so charming, his teeth were, well, they were a mess. He had crooked teeth, chipped incisors, really distinct wear patterns. It was literally these imperfections that made the match so powerful for the jury. They made it possible for experts to say it was a perfect match.
All right, so that's how he got caught. But that's not the whole story, is it? It leads to that much deeper, much more disturbing question that we're still asking today. Why? What could possibly create a monster like Ted Bundy? Well, if you look at the psychological profiles, they all seem to trace the roots of his behavior way back to the very beginning. His entire childhood, it turns out, was built on a massive foundation of secrecy and lies. His family situation was just a mess. Seriously, he was born to an unwed mother, never knew his real father, but here's the real twist. The lie his family told to avoid the shame of it all back in the 1940s, the people he called mom and dad were actually his grandparents, and the woman he thought was his older sister, that was his real mother. Imagine finding that out. That lie was at the absolute core of his identity. And you can almost see how that huge lie could create this deep split inside of him. On the outside, to the public, he was the model kid, well-behaved, quiet, a good student. But on the inside, it was a totally different story. He was lonely, he was bullied, and he was secretly developing these really dark hobbies, like spying on people and petty theft. And there's a term for this in psychology, arrested development. It's like his emotional growth just stopped, frozen somewhere in his preteen years. And that brings us right back to that chilling quote from the beginning, a diseased child's mind in an adult's body. It's a terrifying combination. So you'd think that's the end of the story, right? Case closed, justice served. But there's one last really profound twist here, and it complicates the entire legacy of the very science that put Bundy away. You see, that perfect match, the absolute slam dunk, smoking gun evidence of the trial? Well, today, it's considered one of the most unreliable and heavily criticized forms of forensic evidence out there. The certainty that everyone felt in 1978, it's just gone. Just how unreliable are we talking? Well, a study in 1999 put it to the test. They asked a bunch of forensic odontologists to compare bite marks, and the result was a staggering 63% rate of false identifications. That means they got it wrong more than half the time. So why? Why is it so flawed? Well, think about it. Skin isn't like glass. It's elastic, it's stretchy, it distorts the shape of a bite. Bruising and swelling can change the pattern completely. And on top of all that, we've now learned that human teeth just aren't as unique as something like a fingerprint. Now, let's be clear. Pretty much nobody doubts that Ted Bundy was guilty. Other evidence, and of course his own confessions, confirmed it. But his landmark case leaves us with this really unsettling question, one that the justice system is still wrestling with today. When someone's life hangs in the balance, how certain does our science really need to be?